today it is morning for both of the people on the screen. So I'm here today with Greg Stevens, who, Greg, I think you're actually the first person I met in person from Rasa. So Greg is also up in Seattle with me.
Yeah,
Yeah, do you want to introduce yourself really quick and talk about what your role is here at Rasa?
sure. Yeah, I joined Rasa a year ago. Today's actually my 1 year anniversary. And
Oh, one sec.
can you hear me?
I you were fine. I made a whoopsie. Okay, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I joined Rasa actually exactly a year ago today. And before
Oh,
that, I'd
congrats.
been working with Rasa for a year with a client. I'd been doing some chatbot work on one of the cloud platforms, and in the process of that, discovered Rasa as a nice alternative, and like what it was, what you were able to do with it, and how you were able to customize it. So I've been working with it for a couple of years now. And what I
And
do
you're
now is I'm a solution engineer and work with our enterprise customers on helping them implement Rasa chatbots.
so if you're not one of the companies that works with Rasa, you may not have had the chance to work with Greg directly. All right, so heading over to the YouTube chat, we got quite a few questions, and I'm going to start with Kevin Chetty's question. I'm unable to send the metadata as a post request to the Rasa model. I did read about custom connectors, but found it very confusing. I need to deploy an intent classifier next week. Please help. And it looks like there's no further details on that. Kevin just mentions that they're stuck.
Yeah, so he's on the right track with wanting to do it with channels. That's typically what people are looking at when they're talking about metadata. Is it's data coming in from a mobile app or a web widget, or the user has logged in via whatever the user interface is you're using. Maybe it's Slack, for instance. And so yeah, the channels. I'm trying to think here of a good place to give an example of metadata, um, and probably in one of our existing channels. So let me pull something out, and I'll text a good link on a metadata example. Because what you want to do is in the channel, typically pull out your data that's sent in from the post, from the user channel, and pull it out and stuff that into a location where it'll get picked up by the tracker. So let me find a
And this
link,
is
Rachel,
the
and I'll
post
post that.
request made to Rasa, the Rasa server.
Right.
Question mark.
Yeah, yeah. You want to pull the metadata out of essentially, typically an HTTP, uh, an HTTP request that came in. Pull it out and load it into a place where you're going to pick it up by your action code and put it into a slot. That's kind of typically the way you get that into your Rasa chatbot and into the tracker store.
And I'll share that link in the chat once it comes through.
Yeah.
Hi, Faiza. Good to see you again. Hopefully that was helpful, Kevin. If you have any other additional information or other questions, please feel free to share them. All right. And Raj says, I want to know, how can we use the tracker to store custom data during the conversation? Or how can we pass the custom data from one action to another action, like a user object? Okay, so like a way to store information about, a specific person who's using the assistant, and you want to attach specific pieces of information and then pass it back and forth between different actions, or keep it in the tracker.
Yeah, and I think keeping it in the trackers is the way to go. That's what slots are intended for. So if one action or a form uh, pulls out an entity from an intent, then you typically would store that in a slot, and that slot then becomes available uh, for other custom actions to use. You can both set and get slots. And we have some examples of that on the website here. pull one of those up.
I can also, I'll share my screen. I've got the docs open.
Yeah.
I did this right.
So it's the call
Hey,
is,
it worked.
if you look up the call to set the slot is slot set. If we look that up, and then from the tracker, there's an example called.
Yeah, so this would be in your actions.py file, and you'd need to, import everything that this depends on, then the tracker, and then this will allow you to slot set allows you to change what's in the slot, and I believe it's slot get. Am I right about that?
It's, you want to call the tracker. So it's a tracker, a method on the tracker class called tracker.getSlot is how you then can pull out any slot. There we go.
And then, okay, so this looks like all of the current slot values that have been set. But I was like, this will be.
And that get slot, you can say, I want this specific value, this specific slot's value.
All right, and I have managed to hide the YouTube window. Kevin says, perfect. That's precisely what I was looking for. Fantastic. And he's waiting for the link. And if you send it for me, I'll pass it on.
Yeah.
And hopefully that was, so we just answered Raj's question, and hopefully that answered your question, Raj. Faisa says, can we do a fallback, which is found just like in Dialogflow without specifying anything a user might say in NLU data?
Yeah, and there's a good link. Yeah. I think he and I have just had to answer his question on the forum. There's, and I just sent an update, Faiz, if that's you, to your question. If you go to that conversation patterns, Rachel, underneath that, there's fallback and human handoff. Right. There we go. And so let's scroll through this because I think there's something about that on the forum that wasn't very clear. So scroll back up. Let's see, there's an out of scope rule. Yeah, go to NLU Fallback further down below. Right. Okay, so the question is, somebody asks an intent. We don't have an intent, right? There's an utterance that somebody's issued and it's below the threshold. So you specify the threshold in your config YAML there. You can see this example is 0.7. So anytime there's an utterance and the confidence level is below 0.7, then we're going to have a fallback, NLU fallback issue. So you scroll down, keep scrolling down there, Rachel, and you don't have to define, like there's other places where we talk about having an out of scope event, which can be useful. But in this example, you don't need any intent. Based upon the fact that we fell below that NLU fallback, we have that really simple rule, right? That says, it's kind of a faux intent, I guess you'd call it, NLU fallback. Basically, anytime NLU fallback happens, what do you want to say to the user? And here we've defined an example utterance to say when we don't know what you're asking us, basically. How do we want to handle that?
It's almost like the name John Doe. It just means there's a person and we don't know what their name is. So like NLU fallback. We know there's something was said, but we don't know what the intent classification was.
Right.
Let's see. So hopefully that answered your question, Faiza. Anupam says, how to create a dynamic slot in a custom action on the basis of an entity value. So just to clarify, I'm assuming this is not the situation where you want to save the entity as a slot, but you want to, depending on what the entity is, pick what goes in the slot. Like there's a mapping between the entity and the slot value. I'm assuming.
I'm thinking that the word dynamic is the key part of the question, a dynamic slot. Um, if that's the case, you can't have a dynamic slot. You have to list your slots ahead of time. Yeah. So if it's related to the fact that dynamics aspect, then you could have some generic slots that you could use, or you could have a slot that just can accept multiple values. Essentially have an array or a list of items. I think it depends upon the use case. Is that the question, Rachel, you think they're asking about creating a slot on the fly?
It could be. It's a little hard to get more details in this format, but Anupam, if that was not an answer to your question, feel free to provide more information. Oh, this is a good question from Jefferson Ridgeway. What's the difference between slots and entities?
Yeah, Rachel, I'm sure you could answer that one. I mean, entities are the have to do with the the pipeline, right? And how our pipeline determines that an entity has been found, right? So we have these entity extractors, and you can have multiple entity extractors. So the entity extractor is the first step is finding the entity, and that's going to happen in the pipeline, hopefully with one or more extractors. And once an entity has been found, then the slot is where we want to put it into an actual value that we can use for our stories and rules and actions to actually do make decisions based upon it in our dialogue flow, for instance.
Yeah, so entities can defining what the entity is and picking it out is a machine learning problem, and then once you have the entity, storing it and using it is the slot half of it, I guess.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And like you say, there's two real challenges here: the entity extraction, the machine learning challenge of how do we extract the entity from an utterance is the key challenge there, and then making the decision, okay, now let's store that into a slot that we can then use for our dialogue and other functions within that the bot wants to do.
Okay. Hopefully that answered your question, Jefferson. Question from Herzon, who's mentioned support. Jefferson says thanks. You're very welcome. Okay, so this is a question. So Herzon has asked us a couple of times before on the channel about inputting numbers to go through a menu. So sort of like the old style voice systems. Apparently it's fairly common for assistants on WhatsApp, which is not a platform I use. So we were using Duckling for a numeral extraction and then a rule. And Herzon had a question about how can you do a multi-level menu like that, right? So like option one, one if you want to order pizza, two if you want to order a calzone, and then picking the, one is like pepperoni, two is cheese, and having sort of a hierarchical rule structure like that.
This is a good follow-up question to the prior one. Because entity extraction is going to be one of the issues for the number. So I think there's two approaches to that. One is to use buttons. I think if your UI, if your front end allows the use of buttons are a nice way to handle this for the user. You just push the selection. But that's not an option if you're doing IVR, like you say, and you just or you just have a situation where they want to put the number one. So I would start by probably using Duckling for the entity extraction piece of that, right? Because it's really good at picking out numbers. And And once that number gets pulled out, then we have to make a decision on how that affects the flow of the conversation. So let's go and look at forms, because forms is one place to look at doing this, where you and one of the nice things about 2.0 under forms is slot mappings. We go down there to slot mappings. You're going to be, let's think about this. You're in the middle of a dialogue, and your various steps. Each of these steps can reuse the number 1 and 2 for different purposes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you scroll down there, Rachel, intent, go to some of those examples up above that show where we extract your form, departure city. So within the context of the form, you're going to be at different states. You're going to be asking, this one's asking departure city or arrival city, but imagine those are questions with multiple choices instead of a city. So in this case, one of the things about forms is, one of the nice things that changed in 2.0, just to take a step back, is before for slot mapping, you had to do this in the Python code. And one of the nice things about 2.0 is that you can do these, you can now bring that into this new YAML format that we have. So this form here is saying, we're going to require for this form in order the departure city, arrival city, and arrival date. Or I should say, if I just said I want to go on a trip, and then it's going to ask me those questions in order. So that order, I think, in this example is going to be helpful. You're going to ask several questions moving down a tree if we're going to use a form for this. And so the first one is, which of the first options, whatever the form in the tree is, do you want? Support for Rasa or Rasa X? Let's say that's your question. So, which product? So then what we would have is, how are we going to make our decision? And so we would fill the slot using that from entity. The entity would be number, right? And then we'd have the number 1, 2, or 3 or whatever. So I'd probably use duckling, I'd use from entity, and now we have this situation where they've given us which product in my example, and they've chosen 1, 2, or 3. So then what happens is we have our rule or story that dictates the flow of the conversation. So let's see if this, go down below, Rachel, and we want to see, actually this is more on slot filling. So what we want to do is find a rule, or examples that shows the rule, and how we would dictate the flow. We could do this with a story. This with a story or a form.
Okay, so here's a story example.
Yeah, and so with a story example, we would want an example that's going to use a slot to make a decision, right? Because based upon the slot value, when your first question determines what the next step in the story is going to be. So I'd probably use a form in this case to dictate the flow.
Yeah, I mean, you could also do it as a set of like increasingly complex rules, but that's a pain.
It
It's a
is.
lot of work to maintain.
Right.
And here's one just as clarifying. WhatsApp does not have buttons, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. So let's show a featureized slot example then, if we can find one. Here's one under stories on the docs page. Under concept stories.
Concepts.
Concepts, and then training data. and stories. There we go. And so here's an example where we came back with, Utter asked, how can I help? The response was the inform intent. And now this example shows the response was the location of Rome and the price cheap. And based upon that, our next action was Utter on it. So with stories, that's an example of how you would do with, this would be called a featureized slot then, this number value. So my example question is, which product are you asking about? And they answered 1, 2, or 3. And based upon that, we filled a slot, as was shown on the prior one. And then based upon that slot, we would say the story could be product colon, Rasa. And because they answered Rasa, we're going to go on to the next step, which could be an action. In this case, it's an utterance. It could be asking the next question in the form. So that's one way to do it with stories.
So just sort of providing an example of walking through your options and also what the entities are set as.
Right.
Hopefully that answers your question here, Son. All right. Other questions that we have, extract value text, question mark. That's from Herzon as well. So I'm guessing this is like, how would you get the numbers from the text? And we recommend duckling from that. And if I'm misinterpreting that, feel free to hop back in. David says, there's a problem with Rasa X. It's ordering alphabetically the domain, breaking the form slot mappings order explained here. Okay, I would file a bug report for that on the Rasa. I don't think you can file a bug report on the Rasa X GitHub.
Yeah, you can fire it under our Rasa, under the regular Rasa. Indicate it's Rasa X and go to the Git issues.
Yeah, thank you for letting us know. Filing a GitHub issue is gonna be helpful for that.
Yeah. What was that? Was this about saving a problem when you save your data to Git?
Let's see. Alphabetically ordering the domain, breaking the form slot mapping. I'm not sure if it happens when you save or not.
I've seen this. I think this is a reported issue in Rasa X. In fact, I know it is. I don't know the status. I'll try to look that up. I'm still trying to find the metadata example for the other question, but I know that issue has been reported. I don't know its current status, but I know it's a high priority issue.
But thank you for letting us know. Choppa says, Rasa certification given way, question mark. I know we just launched a self-serve certification thing. I think we just tweeted about it. So I think going to the Rasa Twitter is going to be the quickest way for me to find information about that for you. Yeah, so it's info.rasa.com/Rasa Developer Certification Exam. And I'll paste that link, certification, on YouTube. All right, Jefferson Ridgeway. Sorry, another question. Don't be sorry, that's why we're here. How would one set up a form in a story using from entity for type for each of the slots? How do you set up entities in intents? So I think that might have been asked before we were looking at this example story, where under the intent, we're specifying what the entities are. Yeah, if you're, the recommendation for, if you have a form that's a little bit more complex and maybe you need to like pop in and out of the form depending on the specific things that the person is doing as they're using the assistant, is to build that in Rasa X using interactive learning. So basically, I don't have a Rasa X instance up and running that I can show you really quick. But basically, you're talking to your assistant. At every step, you can see what the assistant classifies, the intent is, extracts the entities as. You can correct those, and then the assistant, whatever it says next, correcting that to be whatever is most applicable for your situation. And then once you finish that conversation, save that as a story in your training data, and then retrain your model is probably the simplest way to, or I don't know, simplest, easiest, most foolproof way to do that is our recommendation. And it makes sense too, because then it's like an actual conversation that you can look through and be like, okay, this makes sense, as opposed to like, okay, this is what the intent is. People could say that different ways, and I find it easier to mentally follow the flow if it's an actual conversation.
So
right.
Rachel, I've got
yeah.
a couple links back on the earlier metadata question.
Oh, fantastic.
So the question was, how do I get my metadata into the chatbot? Mm-hmm. So I gave 2 links to you. Actually, show the second link first.
Do you know how did you send them to me?
I sent them in our private chat, in our Zoom chat.
Oh, in the Zoom chat.
Did I do it? Oh, I can do it in Slack.
I think I can just pop this open. Yeah, there we go. All right.
Okay, so this is so there's 2 pieces to this, getting the metadata in. Let's show the other one. Let's come back to this one. Show the first one here, or show the second link that I sent you, which is into the source code.
There we go.
So this is actually this is the actual source code for the default REST channel. And so if you look at those parameters in this init, you'll see there's a parameter called metadata that you may not have known about. The message ID, the sender ID is in there, and the text of the message are the 2 ones that obviously each message is going to be sent from your front end, whatever that is. But there's this other parameter here, metadata. So this metadata is a dict. So in JSON, you can pass the JSON object there with all your metadata. So that's the first part of the question. If I've got a front end and I want to pass metadata about the user profile information is typical, put it in a JSON object called metadata. So once it's in that object called metadata, this channel code we see right here pulls it out of the metadata and makes it available to our custom actions. So let's go back to that other example link I sent. So this is kind of a funny link to send, but if you look, action session, this is an example piece of code for action session start, which is a useful action in Rasa. Anytime the user starts a session, this event is fired, and you can capture this event. And so this is an example action session start. And if you scroll down, Rachel, to the run, you'll see we reference metadata there. And we're pulling the metadata out of the event. So, so right there, I'm walking through the events in the tracker, and I'm pulling out that metadata object. And then if you go down below, I'm filling in, you should see me filling in slots. Yeah, we go through the key value, and we look at message data slots. And yes, we're doing that slot set call that we talked about earlier. So this is some example code. It's a specific example, obviously, but it shows you the core thing of how do I get my metadata from my user interface into my chatbot so I can take actions on it.
I hope that answers Kevin's question. And I've posted those links in the YouTube chat as well. All right. So let's see. Next question. Oh, Anupam is back with more discussion about the dynamic slots is what their last question was about. I have a use case, it doesn't say cake, where I take some user input info from a form, then I send that information to an external API and get back a result. Depending on the returned result, I need to ask a series of other questions, different questions depending on the result. What is the best approach to do that? I mean, I can tell you what I would do, which is I would do my API call and an action based on the results of the API. I would set a slot, and then I would use that slot value in like this story example where, okay, my slot values are this, and then asking the questions that would correspond to that slot value. I don't know if Greg would do it the same way.
No, that's exactly what I do. Make the API call, and hopefully that can be categorized into values for a slot.
And I think I'm going slightly out of order because it looked like somebody else asked a related question that I no longer see, so never mind. Someone asked, I thought are stories examples, or are stories more like rules where like you're always going to follow the flow of the story? And stories are always examples. So if users start to do something that's not exactly represented in the story, because our a TED policy, for example, is very flexible, it can decide what to do next. But if your users are doing exactly the same thing in the same order that you see in the story, if you have a memoization policy, your assistant will just follow that pathway exactly. So it's not quite a rule. It's not always going to do exactly but if your user is doing the same thing that your story shows them doing, then they'll continue to follow the story. That makes sense. And Jefferson has a question. How do you check for entities in intents after you add the entities in the domain.yaml?
Entities in intents after. Well, that would be in your training examples, right? In your right. And for every intent, you're going to have a lot of examples of utterances, and included in that is going to be examples for the entity.
Yeah.
Right.
So in this example, the intent is greet, and there's a bunch of different ways to greet, and then Sarah here is being identified as a name. And I does this go in the config? Or sorry, does this go into the domain?
That goes in your NLU examples. So yeah, you're going to list the for instance, name is a slot name there. You're going to list that in the domain, just name, but then the examples go in your NLU training data. So in fact, we have these really good example chatbots, the financial demo and another one, help desk demo. And so I'll give you a link. That's a good place to see examples of a lot of Rasa techniques. So right, if you go under data and then NLU, right, and this is still in the markdown format of one
This one's a little.
Yeah, exactly. Show the raw, and then you can see it exactly. So there's examples of credit card or bank IDs down below in one of those. Right, credit card, account type. So there's a good example showing how we have a slot called account type and a bunch of different examples for that. And we have a slot called credit card. Right.
So hopefully that answers your question, Jefferson. Can we use BotFront to develop a Rasa 2.0 chatbot? Oh, I don't actually know.
Yeah, I don't know if Rasa 2.0 does continue to support the markdown format, although we're deprecating it. But there's some really nice new features in 2.0, and I don't know if BotFront supports it. So rules are a completely new thing in Rasa 2.0. So it would have to support that. And then there's the domain. We were showing the other really nice feature I like is that slot filling, slot mapping for forms. And so that's newly added to the domain. You don't have to, as I said earlier, you don't have to write slot mapping functions anymore in Python if you don't want to. So anyway, that's also some changes to the domain file format where you can specify how your slots are filled in. So I don't. Short answer is I don't know.
Yeah, BotFront is like a separate project, so I'd probably ask the
yeah. BotFront is an open source UI for Rasa, and so so yeah, I don't know if they support these new 2.0 features or not.
Good question, Parmar. I hope we answered. Martina says, how to identify, and I scrolled at a bad time, how to identify multiple entities from a single user statement. An example in here, actually.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Well, there's one right there. Yeah.
And these will, I believe, if multiple entities have been extracted from a single term, they're stored as a list in alphabetical order or order of appearance.
Well, these should just fill the two slots. They're kind of, in this case, they're really independent of each other. That utterance should fill the credit card slot with emblem and the account type slot with credit card.
Yeah. I guess I was more asking in situations where you're just using NLU, but that's kind of rare.
Yeah.
Okay. Took the time really quick. Okay, so we got about 20 minutes and quite a few questions. It says, can we collect intents and store it in the NLU data when a user inputs different ways of saying things? Yes, probably the fastest way to do that is using RasaX. I don't know if you'd agree. That would be the fastest way.
Read that again, Rachel.
Can we collect intents and store it to NLU data when a user inputs different ways of saying things? So I'm guessing that this is like saving utterances from users and adding them to an intent as an additional training data.
Yeah, I mean, we call that conversational driven design, and it's exactly one of the main focuses of RasaX. We talk a lot about getting a bot going and getting it getting a basic bot up and running, but it's really important to share your bot with users really early. And RasaX has featured very quickly without having to have a UI. You can share the bot with users just with a quick link that comes up from your RasaX server, and then RasaX lets you review all the conversations people are having, and just like the question that came up, look at the different utterances, because everybody's going to use different phrasing to ask the same question or intent, and RasaX is great at letting you review those, and if the bot's getting confused or it's just another good way of saying something, you can just click on the utterance and say, add this to my training data for this intent. Same thing with this entity extraction, like you still have on the screen. If an entity wasn't picked out correctly, you can mark it in the UI. Somebody said account type different or used another way to say credit card that it didn't pick up. You can highlight that and correct the bot right there in the UI and say, add that to my training data. So yeah, this is exactly what RasaX is intended to do, and it's key to improving the bot, getting it out to users and getting different ways people say things and adding that to your training data.
So hopefully that helped. All right. Hersan says, by default, Rasa returns the sender and text fields using enable API. Would it be possible to return to the consumed intent as well? Okay, so this is launching a Rasa server with an enable API tag. And it sounds like what Tarzan wants is the intent detected by Rasa as part of the returned data structure.
Well, yeah, it sounds like he wants it at an API level. And you can see that in the tracker store. So I'm guessing he wants to do it inside of an action then. And so you can look, I think is the call, yeah, on the tracker, is it get last, I should know this off my head. I think it's get last intent or get last, what is the,
Oh, yeah.
uh, latest?
Latest entity values? Latest action name. So the action is what the assistant's doing.
Yeah.
Get last event.
Yeah.
And we could say that the
yeah, let's see if we can find an example of
some
the
of them.
output. Get
the answer is there is a function that gets this from the tracker store.
There is, yeah, and I can look that up while we continue and pass it back.
Rashmi says issues with Rasa X in the new version. Biggest problem there that I've seen people running into is version mismatch. So I believe you need to have Rasa X 3.0.32 plus, so a number 0.32 or bigger with Rasa 2.0. Earlier versions of Rasa X are not going to be compatible. Also, the next Rasa X update has some cool stuff. So update your Rasa X, see if you're still getting problems. Would be my recommendation. Tarzan says, to know which example intent, I always have to consume the model parse in order to obtain the consumed intention. Okay, so I think this is still trying to figure out, we're trying to get back from the server via your Rasa server via the API, the name of the intent that was detected by Rasa NLU, which is what Greg's looking up now.
I just sent it to you in Slack.
Oh, fantastic. Let me up that. All right, so it is tracker.latest message in square brackets intent.get and then name. So I will paste that in the YouTube chat as well. Habib, can we use multiple mixed languages in the training data? Oh, yes, but you're going to have to build a lot of custom stuff. And I have actually a video on the Rasa YouTube channel that talks about some ways that you might be able to handle that. And I'll just see if I can find that quickly. And it looks like I can't.
I saw a recent blog post, Rachel, you speak to this better than I can, where a person did a Rasa chatbot in Arabic and English, and they added Arabic examples to an existing English bot. But it seems to me most customers doing multiple languages create a separate set of training data for each language and a separate model.
Just gonna open up.
Sometimes you need to build a system that will.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the video NLP for developers, multilingual NLP, and it's on the YouTube channel. But yeah, I think it's most common to have separate models for each language. If you do want multiple languages together, you're probably going to have to provide a lot of training examples to get it to work. It'll be possible, involved, is my diagnosis. David says, how do we make a rule condition for the opposite of slot was set? I'm trying slot was set, slot name null, but it's not working. It's also contradicting with slot was set. Any help appreciated? Okay, so this is a rule that's a negative. So like if not slot was set, then do something.
And the null should work.
So I think I've got an example pulled up here. I think you can just change this to false. So it will check if the slot was set and then the name of the slot and you wanted it to be set or not. I don't think I've actually done this.
That is a Boolean slot called user provided name.
Okay, so it's
and
not
his
whether or not
example
there's a name.
is the value is null. And and I saw this on the forum recently, and null should be working. So it might be best to follow it up on the forum. I'll look and I'll poke around and see if there's any other conversation about it, but it should be, yeah, you should be able to say if user provided was not a true false, if it was just unfeaturized, you could say, you should be able to say null as well as providing a value.
Yeah. So post about it on the forum, and we'll take a look. Also, we should probably add an example about that to the docs. I will make myself a note.
Too, so let me see if I can find that.
Yeah. To docs not set. Okay. Smriti says, do we have any mechanism to send proactive messages or trigger messages automatically in Rasa?
Yeah, there's the external event is a way to trigger a method independently, right? External events, yeah.
Yes, the answer to your question. That was an easy one. Martina says, after migrating to the already existing bot version to 2.0, buttons have stopped working and they mismatch with other bot utterances. Any specific issues or can these be avoided? I haven't tried migrating something with buttons.
So the button, read that one more time for me. I can't, since I can't.
So existing bot migrated to 2.0. Some of the buttons have stopped working. They mismatch with other bot utterances. Any specific issues or can these be avoided?
No, there shouldn't be something specific to buttons. Now, you can, I'm curious if the buttons are, how the button responses are defined. Are they utterances or are you using the slash, the slash syntax to specify the intent? Typically, if you can, you want to just hard code the intent. You know what the response is. So if the response is intent A, just do slash intent A if that's the name of your intent, as opposed to issuing an utterance that should match intent A. Yeah, buttons should show that. Right. So there's the payload is that slash mood great and slash mood sad is saying, don't try to parse this as an utterance. I want you to tell the bot that I'm responding to a specific intent. So I assume that the person asking it is using that syntax. If not, I would use that. I would recommend that syntax for the payload.
Hopefully that helped. And if you have more detailed that you'd like to, if you have a more detailed question, please feel free to take it to the forum, is what I was trying to say. Ooh. All right. Jefferson says, awesome. I appreciate the help. It's literally what I needed today. Happy to help. I'm very happy to have great care. All right. Skylacking says, Trying to get the cancellation status of an event. Users may give a date for a specific event. Some may not give a date. If the user does not give a date, the bot would need to ask which date. Would these need to be different NLU intents? Is the Halloween party still happening on Friday? So just a bunch of examples of intents. It sounds like something I'd use a form for if you need those slots set. That is what you're asking. I'm going to scroll down and see if other things are said. Okay, yeah, so that looks like the question. Okay, so what you're saying is there's an example, you need more information. Yeah, I would use a form, because if you launch a form and let's say the utterance that causes the form to be launched includes all the entities that will fill all the slots that the form is asking for, like it's fine. The form's not going to ask for anything. But if it's missing some of the slots, it'll go through and ask for all the slots you need to answer the question. So that would be my recommendation. Hopefully that's what you're asking. All right. Lisa says, oh, this is a good question. If Stories is not going to follow the steps all the time, then we have to use rules all the time. Does that make sense? So it depends. Stories are examples that your model learns, like good conversation examples to follow. I would say avoid using rules unless you really need them. So like the example that we just talked about, forms are a rule. I need all these slots in order to be able to answer the question. Like an example, if you had a bot that was like selling alcohol, you'd need to make sure that like absolutely you are not selling to minors. And if someone's like, I'm a minor, the interaction immediately stopped, for example. So rules are for when things absolutely positively need to happen in this order, or thing X needs to happen every single time before thing Y can happen. Stories are more, here's ways that the conversations could go. And if people like ask about the weather in the middle of a story, it's not going to completely stop the interaction. If that makes sense. So rules are for things that need to happen in a certain order. Stories are good examples of orders that things could happen in. Hopefully that helps.
We are finding that there are some good uses for rules when something is really a hard rule. So in many cases you can replace a number of long stories with a couple of very short rules. But like you said, it's really kind of a hard-coded thing. If you know anytime this intent happens, you want that response, that's where rules are good.
All right, and we have just a couple minutes left and a lot of questions. So I think at this point, we'll get through what we can. If we don't get to your question, I'll be back next Wednesday with somebody different, another special guest. But always the forums are available, and we try to keep on top of them. All right. Martina says, in case of very minor differences in intents, like small, very small, smaller, is there any way to differentiate these terms when the user puts them in? Will it require any specific configuration? Those sound like things that I would use as entities. So like the size of a drink, or a pizza or a piece of clothing, I would treat that as an entity and save that in a slot value rather than creating a new intent for it. So my personal design preference is for intents to be as general as possible, and specific pieces of information that I want to store about a conversation to use slots as much as possible. And part of that is just the more entities you have, the harder it is for your entity identification to work, because more classes in a multi-class classification problem makes it harder, right? That would be my general recommendation there. Ooh, this is actually a really good one. Mintian Hoang Le says, I want to create a chatbot which can explain things in the middle of a conversation. E.g., can you please explain ... word? Do you have any recommendation on how I can do that? I would do that with a response selector. I'll see if I can find that real quick.
And I think, wouldn't you also want to be using the diet classifier to help you deal with out of context?
Oh, for the smaller drink size example? Yes, I would also recommend diet. If you're using English. I believe diet still only does English. There we go. So for that sort of thing, where people will just have an aside in a conversation and have, a quick, question that they want to ask, and then they'll probably go back to the main flow of the conversation. A response selector lets you have a bunch of intents that you would put under like FAQ or chit chat, and then a bunch of utterances that are responses to specific FAQ or chit chat intents. So it's just a more centralized way to do it. You don't have to provide as many stories to go through, because the general way that the conversation will work is the same regardless of what the question is, if that makes sense. That's what I'd recommend there. Yeah. And Skylacking says, how to set up slots to extract multiple entities of the same type. Say I want a pepperoni pizza and a sausage pizza. So I want a pepperoni side option pizza meal and a sausage side option pizza meal. That's a good question. So you want people to be able to have basically multiple copies of the same slot associated with other slots. Oh.
So you might want to look at the any slot type. You can store arbitrary values, including a dictionary, because it sounds like you may want to have a slot that has an array or multiple. Yeah, if you go to concepts, training, under domain, right, and then slot types, over there on the right, choose slot types, and then there's an any down at the bottom. There's both an any and then there's a custom slot type. So that may be, depending on your use case, that may be a good use. Yeah, they show shopping items, which could be a long list of things. So I think that example fits, right? You could have any number of list of toppings for the pizza.
Or you could have like a data structure where you're adding sort of like, you probably wouldn't want to use a data frame for this, but you could use the data frame or like a column for like item and then side options for it. Yeah. Probably a list would be a better option. Right, here's one says, I have to execute 2 requests. It would be interesting to execute only 1 request and get the sender text, etc., like the IBM assistant. Oh, so this is on getting stuff back from the API and just getting it all back in one object. You could create additional code for that.
Is this referring to the earlier question about getting the intent and not wanting to make a second call? There is an API call that will, given an utterance, will give you a list of the NLU, all of the intents. I wonder if that might solve this question. So you give it the utterance and it gives you the prioritized list of intents and confidence scores.
That might be another option.
You'll find that under the APIs, yeah.
It's in here. Martina says, handling contextual questions while using a form, how do we recognize and make the bot interrupt and say, do you want to continue or answer their question? I would provide a story that does that with your form. And I think we might actually have an example in the docs. No, they're, yeah, okay, these all are under actions. So I think we have a story in here. So this is the rule to activate the form. Here we go. So here's a an example of there's a form going on, and then it gets stopped and the slot wasn't filled. Oh no, so this is just submitting the form.
Oh, there's your null example from the earlier question. Requested slot, a slot that has a null value, by the way. Slot was set, and anyway, sorry to jump out of context,
nice.
but we were looking for an example of that, and that should work for that one.
Oh, I did a thumbs up. I don't think you can see my video. Example here, if there's a form going on and users like, oh, what's the weather like? Then you can provide an example where you respond to that in form. All right. Martina says, I'll try to post it in the form in case it does not work. Yeah, hopefully it works, but the forum is a good place for specific questions. Storyteller says, rules are like where clauses. Yeah, you can think of like them, or if when. If when, that's nothing. If then.
If then, yeah.
Exactly. All right. Kyle says, are rules state machines? Ooh, technically.
Yeah, I mean rules can involve Python code, and so yes, you could create a state machine. You can really kind of create anything, any kind of logic you want, I think, with rules.
Yeah.
Between rules and the Python, Python ability to call Python actions within rules, you could create a state machine or any other, people use knowledge-based systems at the back end of custom actions that could use far more advanced logic on how the flow of the conversation should go.
So I would say they can be, but they are not definitionally state machines. It's been a while since I've looked at the formal definition. Yes, do use both. Don't just use rules. I mean, you can, but headache. Okay, so we're a little past 10 now, and let's do one more. Martina, do you have any examples of human handoff to Slack?
Oh,
I think the help desk has a bot-to-bot example.
We have one that's not Slack specific, but the financial demo we added recently, a handoff. If you go to the financial demo, there's a handoff example, and we use a web widget to switch. In this case, we're not doing a human handoff, but the concept is the same. Yeah, where we're switching between two different bots, but conceptually it's the same. So that's an example. At least using a web widget front end. So your front end has to, there's something that has to, your front end has to be knowledgeable about the handoff, right? It has to know when it's sent back some utterance or metadata or however you want to do it, that indicates that it needs to talk to a different endpoint. But that should help.
So you can copy and modify. All right. I think, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Lots of questions. I hope we helped. And if you have more questions, please feel free to put them on the forum. Obviously, we're not going to answer them instantly, unless you happen to like just have really good timing and happen to ask a question while someone is in answering feeling moment. I'm tired.
Well, thanks,
Thanks so
Rachel.
much
It
for
was
joining,
fun to
Grady.
do this with you today.
Yeah, it was nice. It was good to talk with you as well.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
So, bye. Have a great day, everyone. I'll be back tomorrow with the paper reading group with Vova, which would be very exciting. And I will see you then. Bye.